All right, I want to talk real quick about some objectives of this presentation. So we're talking about land platting and graphing, which is taking a land record, understanding the description, and then drawing that out, understanding the shape of that land. So we're going to talk about the differences between meets and bounds and township and range systems. We'll talk about which of the United States use each of those systems. We'll talk through some key terminology, some units of measurement, understanding what those mean. We'll work on transcribing some land descriptions. So if you've got a deed, where do you find the information you need to then go through and plot or graph that out? And then we'll talk through step-by-step meets and bounds and township and range. And I've drawn out some examples for you so that you can understand when it's your turn, here's my deed, how do I go through all of this? The handout has all of these things written down step by step. I've got some practice deeds linked at the bottom of that handout if you want to pull one of those up and go through the steps on your own. I am more than happy after the fact to have you email me, ask me questions, talk things through. My email is also on that handout. So let's get into this. Land platting versus land graphing. So we're talking again, drawing out the boundary description of a piece of property. We're pulling from usually a land deed. You might find these in other records as well. Platting refers to meets and bounds meaning measures and boundaries. Graphing is talking about the system township and range, which is also called rectangular survey. So that's the difference between those two terms. State land states and federal land states. So this is going to help us understand which states are going to be using these systems and why. So state land states consist of the original 13 colonies, states created from those colonies when they were splitting up, Hawaii and Texas. So here is a comprehensive list for you of all of those different states. So these states retained their land survey and systems after the federal government was created. So when they were colonies initially, and then with Hawaii and Texas, when they were brought into the country, they already had their own system set up. So it didn't really make sense to have them stop doing what they were doing, bring them into this new rectangular survey system and kind of rewrite all of the way that they've been doing their deeds. So they just were like, you know what, we're just going to leave that be. So all of these states are going to be using generally, again, no always in genealogy, right? Generally, you're going to be finding the meets and bounds system with these state land states. Federal land states, this is the land acquired by the federal government outside of those states that use the state land system, and thus was sold by the government as public domain. So this is any state that is not on the previous list. Again, the handout can give you a good list of those. And these are going to be using what we call the rectangular survey township and range system. So when you're starting out looking for a land record, it's really helpful to know even from the get-go, oh, I'm looking in Virginia, West Virginia, one of those, I'm going to be expecting this to be meets and bounds. Or, oh, I'm looking in Kansas, which is where a lot of my ancestors are from, I'm going to be functioning mentally in a rectangular survey system. All right, real quick, I want to talk about why we even would want to do land platting and graphing. A lot of times, land records give us clues about relationships. You can often see people selling land to family, close neighbors that later become family, depending on who everybody's marrying. So being able to track the ownership can give us clues about these relationships. This one could be really helpful if you've got multiple individuals of the same name, and you know that one of them is the guy that has the land down by 6 Mile Creek, and you know that the other one is the guy that has a house like in town, then it can help you track the differences between those families. Family members live close by often, so if you're platting multiple people's land, it can help you determine like, oh, they both shared a neighbor in these land deeds, but on opposite sides of each other. So they're living close together. Maybe they have one guy's land plat in between theirs, and that can give you a clue of how closely they're interacting and the likelihood of them being family. Neighbors are often mentioned in deeds, especially in meets and bounds. So if you're platting everyone's land, if you have the spare time to go through a deed book and plat an entire neighborhood's worth of deeds. But if you're noticing names pop up in records in other places, look for their deeds. You can plat some of that out and help you piece together an actual map of a neighborhood to help flesh out your fan network. It's also just nice to know the size, shape, location of the land that your ancestors were living on. It's nice to know, oh, they were right by, there was a lot of trees in their area, or they were really far from water, or they were far away from a courthouse. So maybe they're going to the courthouse in the next county to get married instead of having to cross that river to get to the other courthouse. So it can get into the nitty-gritty and really just kind of build a picture that can give you some clues and to just help you better understand your ancestors. It can also be nice to track the land divisions, which could be indicative of relationships. If you have a plat that's all of a sudden divided into 5 pieces, and you're like, oh, maybe these are heirs of the individual who had this land, and maybe they've passed and are dividing this up legally into 5. So that can be helpful when you're drawing out these descriptions. Okay, let's get into land platting. Terminology here, you're going to want to look for words such as chain, link, rod, and pole, which are all units of measurement. Look for phrases including degrees, like south 45 degrees west, or geographical landmarks, the oak by the tree, or a stake and stones, which is a stick in the ground with rocks around it. If you see anything including fractions, halves, quarters, or sections, townships, and ranges, then this is not a meets and bounds deed. That is rectangular survey. So if you see that, switch to the second half of the handout and start over there. Some terms here. This, if I remember correctly, I believe I put this in the handout. If not, just email me and I'll send it over. This is just to kind of help you know what chains and rods and poles and things are equal to. So 1 chain, for example, is equal to 4 rods, which is 100 links, 1 link being almost 8 inches. And you can kind of piece together, if you really want to get into how big exactly things were, this can be helpful. Okay, so let's do one. Let's grab a deed and we'll go step by step and we can see how this is going to work. All right, so before we get started, graph paper is going to be easiest. You can give it a go on other paper. I personally love straight lines, so I am always a graph person. You want a pencil with an eraser because we all make mistakes and that's fine. Protractor or a surveyor's compass. I just have a protractor that I grabbed at like arts and crafts store. They do make special compasses for this. I don't do it often enough to merit grabbing one of those, and this will work just fine. You will need a ruler with millimeter markings. And my protractor has millimeters on the inside right there. So that's just what I'm going to use. All right, start off reading through your deed and you need to figure out where your description begins. So these deeds have a lot of legal jargon at the top and the bottom, and usually the description's somewhere right in the middle. Look for phrases like bounded as follows or beginning at. So here's a deed that I grabbed. And right here in the middle, I found the phrase bounded as follows to wit. So that is where the official description is starting. You can see, if you can read a little bit. Above that, we've got 250 acres lying on Flat Creek and bounded as follows. So this is where we're going to start. Okay, second step. On another piece of paper, this isn't required, but it can be very helpful, especially if you've got a long description. You want to transcribe the description. What I would suggest is put each measurement description on its own line and put each, what I call a corner description, on its own line as well. So you want to like really space this out so you know you're not missing anything. So here is my whole description, and I've boiled it down to this. So I have beginning on a white oak on the south side of the creek. That's like a corner, right? It'll be a corner of this description. And then I have the thence north 50 degrees west on 180 poles. And then the next line, to a chestnut on the bank of a little stream, right? So you want to really space this out. Again, you don't have to do it this way, but this is the way my brain works. So this is what I would suggest. You need to make sure that you're noticing in your deed what the primary length unit of measurement is. So often, like I said, rods, poles, or chains. you want to assign 1 millimeter to one primary unit. So that's going to be your scale. Do be aware that they could change this halfway through the deed, especially if they're using like chains and then they switch it to links. Be aware again, like we said, right? One chain is 100 links, so you'll have to scale that down if you notice that they're changing that. So here in our description, they're using poles, and it doesn't look like they changed that. So we'll make 1 millimeter equal to 1 pole. All right, so get to your paper, mark a dot for your starting point. Generally, it's helpful to start in the middle. You'll start to kind of get a sense when you're reading through of where these are going to go. So I chose a dot in the corner because I could tell that I was going to need some space to move. I would put a basic compass rose up at the top because if you're turning your paper to be drawing lines, you need to always make sure you know where north is, right? Because that's how these descriptions are written out. And I always like to put what equals 1 millimeter so that if I'm halfway through or even just giving this to a client or somebody else, then we know what our unit is. Read through your directions, the first line. If the first cardinal direction is north or south, the flat edge of your protractor needs to be vertical. And if it's east or west, it needs to be horizontal. If the second direction, and by second direction, I mean when it says like north 50 degrees west. So your first one is going to tell you flat edge. And the second direction is going to tell you where the curve of the protractor needs to be. So if the second one says north, then your curve needs to be on the top or the northerly direction of your paper. South on the bottom, east on the right, and west on the left. So for us, we start out north 50 degrees west. So that means that my protractor needs to have the flat edge vertical and the curve on the left, because that's our north and our west. So start at your dot and put your protractor where it needs to be according to that. So the first direction is going to indicate which end of your protractor you're measuring the degrees from. So here's my dot right in the middle, kind of hard to see. And we need to go north, right? Because that was our first direction in our description. So then from the north, we need to move the number of degrees toward the center of the protractor. So here we've gone north towards the top of the protractor and down 50 degrees west. So that's our dot. So take your protractor off, and now we need to draw a line from the starting dot to the second dot, the length indicated. We cannot just connect these two dots unless the distance on my protractor is magically the number of poles to millimeters, right? So here we have north 50 degrees west, 180 poles. So I need to draw a line that's 180 millimeters. And you can see right there in the middle, that's where I drew my 50-degree line or my 50-degree dot, but we had to go way farther than that. So don't just connect your dots. Okay, again, you don't have to do this part, but I have to manually cross off what I just did. I need to know where I am. So I'm going to cross that one off. We did that line successfully. So make sure you're erasing your guide dots, the ones that are showing you your direction, so that you know exactly where you're working from. I always try to label exactly where I'm at because those corner descriptions are going to be important, especially if they give somebody's name, right? So it's like draw, north 50 degrees west, 180 poles to John Williams' eastern line, right? Then you're going to want to know this is the point where this land meets up with John Williams' line. So here we just have our chestnut on the bank of a little stream in my very poorly drawn artistic skills, but there it is. All right, so we're going to keep going. That's the main steps for this, is knowing where your protractor is oriented. You have to make sure you're matching with your directions. Don't just connect your dots. Make sure you're doing your measurements all the way. If you can, don't rotate your graph paper, or if you do, be aware that you need to be keeping north in mind. You have to make sure that you're using that as your grounding point for your protractor direction. So for us next, we need to do our north 40 degrees west, 14.5 poles. So from that dot, we're going to go up. There's our dot. And here's our 40 degrees. We're still going northwest, north 40 degrees west. And for this one, we need to draw 15 millimeters. I rounded up very small line there. So again, don't connect your dots. And that description just said to a stake. So there's my stick stuck in the grass. Our next one says south 50 degrees east, 180 poles. So here we are. We still need to have this flat edge be vertical because now we're going south, but I flipped my protractor because now we need to head east. And reminder, when we're doing this, since we're now doing south, I need to measure up from the bottom of the protractor. So here's my little dot from the stake. And now we're doing south 50 degrees east. You can see that dot right there. And we needed another 180 millimeter line. Looks like this one also went to a stake. And then it says, thence a direct line to the beginning. Sometimes you're going to get portions in the deed that say southerly along the riverbank towards the white oak or whatever. And that's not something that you are going to necessarily know right off the bat what that riverbank looks like. So if you ever get in a situation like that, what I say is stop where you're at, drop to the end of the deed, flip all the cardinal directions, and work backwards as much as you can. You might need to get creative. It might be that you don't quite have enough information to draw the whole thing, but if you find yourself in a spot like that, do your best to work backwards towards whatever undisclosed line is in the middle there. So for us, there's our little stake again, direct line to the beginning. Just draw that out, which if you wanted to figure out is the exact opposite, right, of the other end. So also 15 millimeters there. So, and then there's my white oak on the south side of the creek from the beginning. So there we go. Some reminders here, round up or down, any fractions that are too small. Just remember if you rounded up or down, try and be consistent with that. Make sure you're labeling everything. Again, like I said, if you get to a point where it's not descriptive enough, go back to the beginning dot, drop to your final instruction, reverse your cardinal directions, and work backwards. So here I am labeling exactly what was in there. And this is what we ended up with. This was an interesting one to me, and I drew this out and I was like, what on earth is this land sale? And I'm wondering if it was like a water rights sort of a sale, if someone's like just gonna sell off this little portion on the side of my land so that someone else can have access to some water. I don't know, but it is an interesting little slice, and I kind of want to know a little bit more about what was happening there. I know that was a lot of information. Again, the handout has everything that you need. Don't panic, it's gonna be fine. So we're gonna now shift gears into graphing land. This one, we're looking for words like quarter, section, township, and range. These ones, you do want to see the fractions. So if you see anything northwest quarter, southern half, then you know that you're in the land graphing realm. You're not seeing meets and bounds terms. Some of these are going to have some, and again, here I am, right? Always, you can't ever have an always. You might see some meets and bounds terms like chains and rods. The thing is, to help you distinguish whether or not you are land graphing or land platting, is that these deeds will also usually include quarter, section, township, and range. So you might get something that is in the northwest quarter of township 13 of whatever, then within the description it might say something about chains and rods. Maybe they have to factor in that there is like a river in that whole township that belongs to somebody else. So if you do see both terms, both sets of terms, err on the side of land graphing. If you don't see anything that talks about the quarters and you're seeing things that are more degrees, err on your land platting side. Okay, so here is some terminology definition stuff. One of the biggest things to think through here is baselines and meridians. So essentially, all through the country, there are multiple baselines and meridians. A baseline is an imaginary line running east and west that will intersect at some point with a meridian. A meridian is the same thing north and south. So some states have multiple baselines and meridians within them. There are some groups of states that all share the same baseline and meridian. I live in Utah, and I know that our baseline and meridian crosses in downtown Salt Lake City, and I can walk to the marker and ta-da, here's our baseline meridian intersection. But the baseline and meridian is what the township and range system is measured by. They're like your X and Y axis. So if you're seeing baseline meridian, then that's what that's talking about. And I'll show you a map a little bit later on of where you can figure out which one you're using. Township can be a little confusing. It has multiple definitions. A range is townships that run east to west from the meridian. A section is a measurement of land, which is 1 square mile. A township is either a measurement of land, which is 6 miles by 6 miles. These are measured north-south from the baseline. A government unit responsible for an area of approximately 36 square miles. So township can be big and it can be small, and it can be kind of confusing which one you're looking at. But you'll start to figure it out once we get into this and the more that you're looking at these. A tract is a parcel of land. Just here is your tract of land, or a portion of a meridian section about 24 miles square containing 16 townships. So some of these words, like I said, are tossed around, used for different sized things. It can be a little confusing, but this should be in your handout, so you can come back and reference and figure out which version of that term you're seeing. Okay, step by step through some land graphing. Again, graph paper is handy. You can use any paper, but especially with these fractions, it's nice to have graph paper, a pencil with an eraser, ruler. Or you could do this a little bit more easily in a word processor, a paint program, or a design site such as canva.com. So because these are by and large rectangles and squares of different sizes, this is something that you could do digitally a little bit easier than the other land platting system. All right, so we're going to start out transcribing again the description of the land so that it's easier to read. Here is a deed from Washington County, Kansas, which is where my ancestors hail from. If you notice, this is much shorter. It's just kind of by nature a more truncated deed because the description doesn't need to be quite so long, which can be nice. So here we have the west half of southeast quarter and the east half of the southwest quarter of section 28, township 5 south, range 4 east. So with land graphing, you're going to work backwards from the largest division, find the township and range relative to the baseline and meridian on your map. So here's what I was mentioning before. Here's a map. You can see all of the state land states are white because they don't need this because they have their own system. This I just pulled up from Google, so it should be fairly easy to find and figure out what your baseline and meridian are. So you can see that there's pieces here and there that have their own baseline and meridian, like there's a portion of Utah that is on its own. Wyoming has a little chunk that's got its own thing. I would like to point out Ohio is quite the mishmash of baselines and meridians. They're a very interesting conundrum land records wise. So if you find yourself doing land in Ohio, head on over to the Family Search Wiki and just figure out where exactly in Ohio and what that should look like for you land-wise. I know there are a couple places where they were like, here's a city that burned down in like Pennsylvania or somewhere, and we'll just give everybody in that city some land over in Ohio. And now that baseline meridian section is just all those people that were in that city and moved to Ohio. So there's some interesting stuff there. All right, so like I mentioned, we're working in Washington County, Kansas. So here we see that the baseline is the northern border of the state of Kansas, and our meridian is about 2/3 through the state. So anytime we're seeing mention of the baseline meridian for Kansas, this is what we're looking at. So it's good to know this is the 6th principal meridian. If you go down into Oklahoma, it's slightly different and it's named something else. So knowing the names of them can be helpful, but again, you could just look that up pretty easily. Okay, so working backwards, we need to figure out our township and range. So here's our description down at the bottom. We've got township 5 south, range 4 east. So what that's going to mean is from our baseline, which was the northern border of Kansas, and our meridian, essentially, like I mentioned, it's an X and Y axis. So we need to go 5 south and 4 east. And so that is the area that our land is going to be in, which puts us in this section here, right about there is where this, excuse me, where this square is. Okay, so now that we've located that, we need to go to the next largest division, which is often the section number. So this is the square that we pulled from our map just now. Sections are numbered from 1 to 36, because this is 6 miles on each side, from 1 to 36 in a serpentine manner beginning at the top right-hand corner. I don't know who picked that. It's not the most intuitive thing to me. I'm glad that they liked it. It doesn't make sense to me. So what I mean by that, from the top right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then drop down 7, 8, 9, and you're snaking back and forth. So that is how these are numbered. So for us, we have section 28 is the next largest division for us. So that one is right there. Again, lots of squares getting bigger and smaller. This is now section 28, which we just pulled from here. So now I'm dividing section 28 into fourths so that we can figure out, because these are our quarters, right? And our land deed, it was talking about quarters. So we need to find in our deed where you start getting cardinal directions and the fractions. So we have the west half of the southeast quarter and the east half of the southwest quarter, which is right there. So again, still working backwards, we have to figure out which quarter of this section our little fraction is talking about. So southeast quarter is the lower right-hand quarter of this section, which is first little chunk of this portion. And then keep making that smaller. We need to divide this up in fractions according to what that said. So for us, we need to find the west half of this southeast quarter, which is this little slice. So this is the first portion of the tract of land that this person is buying, is this west half of the southeast quarter of the section. Again, lots of information. You're doing great. Reach out if you need any help. So we're going to keep dividing things up until we have worked through every single description in one of these deeds. So we did the west half of the southeast quarter, but we're not done, right? We still have the east half of the southwest quarter. So our southwest quarter is this one, right? And now we need the east half of that, which is this. So you can see that this individual is buying a square of land. They're together. So they still needed to write it out as 2 separate little pieces because of the system, the way it works. So we have the east half of one, west half of the other. It is still the same amount as one of the quarters, but it's a little bit offset. Okay, so reminders here. You always want to work from the largest division backwards to the smallest. Again, we're in land graphing, right? So this is our rectangles, backwards from largest to smallest. Don't forget all of the little descriptions that are included in your deed. You could have quite the list of quarters and halves of different portions. And if you don't get all of them, then you're missing out pieces of that land. So make sure you're rereading, catching all of those little pieces. Reminder too, that land purchases can cross the quarter section or township boundaries, but still be one large land tract. So in our case, we saw that the square of land was divided in half because of the nature of that division. But you could see things like this, where you have land crossing sections, right? So if you have land in sections 5 and section 6, then you might say, oh, well, of course that's right next to each other. But if you have land in sections 11 and 14, I'm like, oh, that's weird. Why are they buying those 2 pieces at the same time? But by knowing that it goes in a serpentine direction, it turns out that 11 and 14 are right next to each other. Or you could have a situation like 28, 29, 32, and 33, where you're getting a quarter of each of those that builds up one section of land. So being aware of this numbering system can really be helpful when you're trying to piece together fan networks, relationships. If someone's like, oh, someone lived in section 9, but then their family moved to section 16, that's so far. It really actually isn't. I did see somewhere one time that I can't remember if it was section 15 or 16. One of those they usually reserved land in for a school. So if you know that somebody's living close to a school, then you can bet that they're probably close to section 15 or 16 right there in the middle of that township. Okay, so this is kind of fun. Anyone that has flown over the United States probably has noticed all of these rectangles. This is Kansas, Washington County, Kansas. Hollenberg right there is where my ancestors were from at one point. And you can see all of these divisions, right? They're dividing it up as per the township and range system, and you can see how that changed the landscape. And so it's kind of fun to know now that that's what that is. And I like to sit and think, what township and range was that? I wonder if they own all of that. And my husband, who's an engineer, just thinks it's funny. But I enjoy that, but to each their own, right? Alrighty, that is everything that I had for you in terms of info dump, which I know it was. I am so happy to take questions now. I know that there might be a lot, and again, check your handout, work it through. It might be kind of confusing when you start, but I know you can do it. And hopefully I've given you some good information to really get into it.
Thank you. So we do have a few questions for you that we can get into. Um, the first one says, even though Indiana is a rectangular survey system state, some of the legal notices says usually for repossession or mortgage foreclosure in the newspaper use the meets and bounds description of the tract, and they're wondering why.
I don't have as much personal experience in Indiana, but what I would probably say to like be figuring out the difference there is to get into the land records, right, and go further back. It would be interesting to know at one point if they did switch or why that would be the case. I don't know if there's like a legal reason to want to
Mhm.
use one or the other. My guess would be that it might have something to do with like water or lumber rights or something within a rectangular survey, something, but that's interesting. And I want to go figure out now why they would be using both. But I hope that's a decent enough answer. Sorry, I don't know exactly why they might specifically be using both in that case.
Thank you. Our next one is kind of a two-parter. So the first one, or the first part says, are the terms rod, pole, and perch derived from the items they use to do their measurements? For example, chain, did
Yes,
they use a real chain?
they did. And I didn't know this about George Washington, but when he was a teenager, he was a land surveyor. And so if you go to Mount Vernon, they have in like a case his chain. It's like sitting there. I'm like, oh, that is the chain, I guess, that they would have used. So yeah, when they're using those words, it really was a chain that they lugged around and they would lay down. Here's one chain, here's the next chain, here's the next chain. And I'm grateful it wasn't my job. I'm glad somebody did it. But yes, those are referring to actual physical objects.
Thank you. And then the next part of the question is, they're asking, where can I find more information about the men who did the survey, like the chain men? Were they men living in the area, or was that of the surveyor, was that a position that did lots of surveys? And they say they have a couple ancestors who were chainmen on two Virginia surveys in 1795.
Oh, that's a cool connection to have. Um, I don't know. I think you could probably even go to like the Mount Vernon page. I'm sure they have a little blip there on why on George Washington doing it right. And I think you'd get more information on people that were prominent that had experience with that. My guess would be that the county would have a couple surveyors. It's just like, hey, are you available to go do this one? It's kind of out by your land. Can you take some people to go out and do that with you? So my guess would be that it would be a fairly localized thing. They would probably have a couple people on hand to do that. But yeah, I don't know if that was like you could look into if there's town records, see if there's a specific so and so's the chain man for the year. I don't know. But that's an intriguing connection to have.
This question says, is there a set numbering system for townships in a county, or does that vary from county to county and state to state?
So in terms of the like serpentine numbering, that is standard from what I understand. So if we're talking like I mentioned, township 16 or 15 is usually the one with the school, then that sort of township numbering is going to be the same. The other use of township being township 5 south, range 3 east, right? Those larger chunks where you're trying to narrow into your section. That should be fairly standard as well. I would assume that they're standardized. And if you find that it's not, I wouldn't be absolutely shocked because nothing is ever as consistent as we want it to be. But I think you could err on the side of those being standard numbers.
Thank you. The next one is, would you need to plat the land adjacent to the one you are interested in?
Yes and no. I mean, yes and no. That depends, I think, on your research question, which is a completely different lecture, right? On creating like good research questions for yourself. If your purpose in platting the land is to just know about the shape of it, then no, not necessarily. You wouldn't need to plat that one. If you are platting the land in hopes of learning more about the neighborhood, then I would absolutely go grab a couple of the other ones. And like I mentioned in a lot of these, they'll say to this corner of so-and-so's land or up to the line that we mentioned 2 years ago when this other guy bought it, right? So sometimes you might have to dig a little bit. But yeah, that'll be more based on what your objective is and why you're platting. But by all means, if you've already drawn a portion of it, right, might as well do the next whole section.
Our next question is, do you know if there was a formal recognition to become a surveyor? They say they have several surveyors and chainmen on surveys.
No, I like him. This is really piquing my curiosity in exactly how that part of this process went. I mean, mostly assumption, I guess, some of the like the deeds and things I've looked at. I think that it would be mostly like an appointment at like the county level. Um, again, if you can get into maybe some court records where they're kind of setting things up for the year, maybe land records, you could check the beginnings of the book and see if there's any notations there. These were surveyed by so-and-so who was surveyor from such date to another date. But yeah, I don't know. I'm really curious now how they picked those guys.
Looks like one more question. So they're asking, are there any restrictions on how many times or how small an area of land can be reduced?
My thought there could be maybe if the land was like given as part of like a probate, then there could be some restrictions just based on how many heirs or like a woman. So if you have a husband and a wife and they buy land, then the woman is legally tied to 1/3 portion of that land, which is called her dower. Her dower right is 1/3 of that land piece. So if that land is sold, then in regards to her dower, that would have to be factored into the land sale. And often if you have a deed down at the bottom, they'll say, we took Mrs. So-and-so aside, talked to her separately. She agrees that yes, she knows what's happening and she's signing off on her dower right. So that if they don't do that and then the man dies, she legally could come back and say, I still have dower right on that land. And they would have to give her 1/3 of that. So those are my thoughts, is if it's a probate division and there are specific legal divisions based on that, they might have some rules on who can divide up how much, or if you're dealing with dower right stuff, that might have some provisions. But I mean, like we saw, right, the little teeny, I guess it wasn't tiny, 250 acres, that's quite a bit of land, but it was a very long slice of land, right? So I don't know otherwise if they would have any rules on dividing that up.
Thank you. And I lied. We had a couple more questions that popped in. So somebody's
fine.
asking, what do you do? How do you address rental land?
Oh, that's different, obviously. In that case, it's not going to be, I guess it depends on if you're looking for the landlord or the renter, right? Like what you're trying to figure out. Landlord perspective, you'd still be working with it the same because you'll get a description there. I have seen a few deeds where it does mention that so-and-so is getting this piece for the payment of such and such a year, right? And more of like a rental situation. So I think that would depend on how the county is choosing to record those types of land renting situations. But once you get into the deed, it should still be the same types of descriptions for you to draw it out, but it could be helpful for you to note this wasn't a land ownership situation, right? So finding someone 2 generations later of the same last name might not be the same, might not be the family as if it was a piece of land passed down through the family.
And the last one here says some of the censuses you will find say it is for a township. Is that the same as one of those townships in the surveying info you gave? If so, then they say then a township name could eventually be for several survey townships.
Yes, yes. Township, again, it's one of those words that it's just like everyone just likes it. And so just uses it in multiple situations. When you're looking at a named township, I don't know how exactly that's going to pan out to your numbered specific townships. I would not
Mm-hmm.
assume that those are one-to-one. If you're out somewhere that's fairly rural and you don't have a lot of communities that are forming outside of like those numbers, then I could see it kind of mapping up to be about the same. But when we're getting into named townships, I would not assume that that's the same size or same shape as those numerical ones.
That is helpful. Thank you.
Of course.
So our email again is genealogy@acpl.info for anybody that has any follow-up questions or if you'd like a copy of the chat. So thank you again so much, Amy, for your time and for your
Of
presentation.
course. Thanks for having me. I love doing stuff like this. So glad to be here.
Thanks. Have a good night.